So for this new unit, we're going to be working and focusing on a turbulent time in the 17th and 18th centuries. So this is going to take place between 1625 and 1798. And we call this the neoclassical century. So to start, we have our king, Charles I, who's going to be crowned king in 1625. And he ends up actually clashing with Parliament over money. Money is a big issue here. King Charles needed money to fund some wars that he was in, and Parliament refused to actually fund those. So instead, the king started extorting loans from wealthy subjects and pressed the poor into service as soldiers and sailors against their will. Parliament tried to prevent these abuses of power, and Charles eventually dissolved Parliament so they wouldn't let them meet, and he wouldn't call it into session for another 11 years. He's also known and insisted that the clergymen conform or observe all ceremonies of an Anglican church, and the Puritans, or Calvinists, who wished to purify the church of Catholic traditions were enraged by some of those requirements. So he was known to be religiously intolerant and enforce his own beliefs. Puritans believed that each group of worshipers, moved by the members' divinely granted consciences, had the right to choose its own minister. It was an idea that dangerously was kind of close to democracy, and that's what he didn't like. For these and other ideas, dissenters were persecuted and tortured as criminals, and that was all under Charles I. His problem only grew worse, though, after he was forced to fight Scottish rebels outraged by this religious conformity that he was trying to push. So, desperate for money, he actually ended up summoning a hostile parliament, because, of course, parliaments took that up. Parliament actually ended up condemning Charles I as a tyrant in 1642, and civil war broke out. In 1645, Parliament's forces were led by a man named Oliver Cromwell, in the picture here, and he defeated the Royalist army and captured Charles. Because the radical Puritans dominated Parliament during this time period, they actually tried and convicted the king, King Charles, for treason because of his intolerance against their religion. He was actually beheaded on January 30th, 1649, and Cromwell ends up leading the new government and calls it the English Commonwealth. He ends up dissolving Parliament in 1653 and names himself Lord Protector, and ends up ruling as a dictator until 1658 when he died. However, that free society that he promised at the start of the Civil War never actually showed up. It never materialized. It not only led to the free society, it didn't lead to the free society that many of them fought for. The hopes and economic hardship led to unrest. The Commonwealth was fueled by dissent by outlawing all of these things. It was gambling, horse racing, newspapers, fancy clothes, public dancing, and even the theater were all outlawed, so people couldn't go to these things. By Cromwell's death, England had had enough taxation, violence, and disorder. In 1658, Parliament offered the crown to the exiled son of Charles I, who became Charles II in 1660. The monarch was then restored, so we call this the Restoration, restoring of the monarchy. He was a patron of the arts and was responsible for allowing women even the right to act on stage. In sharp contrast to the drab Puritan leaders, Charles II and his court copied the plush fashions of Paris. He was an avid patron of arts and science and invited Italian composers and Dutch painters to live and work in England. After Charles II, his successor was James II. He was known to be a devout Catholic, and there were a lot of deep religious differences between James and then the Protestant Parliament. So Parliament invited Mary, the Protestant daughter of James II, to rule England jointly with her husband William of Orange. So this is where you get William and Mary. And then rather than fight about this, James ended up escaping to England. The people ended up hailing this event as the Glorious Revolution of 1688 because not a drop of blood had been shed for this change or shift in the monarchy. William and Mary agreed to Parliament's Bill of Rights that they put before them that led the way to the development of their current system of government in Great Britain, which is a constitutional monarchy. This bill guaranteed Parliament the right to approve all taxes and forbade the monarch to suspend the law. It was a unified Parliament that was led by a prime minister. By the late 1600s, new farm tools made it possible for farms to produce much more food. The population then surged upward. Many people left the countryside, and there were a lot of growing towns. They became factory hands who ran machines in the early Industrial Revolution. So those new tools led to greater production, which in turn reduced the need for farm workers who moved to the city to find work. We also had the Industrial Revolution that took place. British inventions after 1750 made the spinning and weaving of cloth much more efficient. The steam engine was perfected and adapted to run a power loom. Factories were built to produce vast quantities of cotton cloth. Merchants sold the goods all over the world, and as late as the 1790s, most were still earning a living as farmers. These British inventions greatly increased the efficiency of production and stimulating the rapid expansion and prosperity in England. Another movement that took place during this time is called the Enlightenment. It was the scientific revolution that made industry possible. It stemmed from a larger development that was known as the Enlightenment. Through reason and observation of nature, human beings could discover an order to all underlying things. And then this is also the time period in which Sir Isaac Newton discovered the theory of gravity. Even though we had all of these movements of progress during this time period in England, by the mid-1700s, the excess of the Industrial Revolution was overshadowing the Enlightenment. Misery and poverty ended up giving pause to writers and intellectuals of the day. During this time, men, women, and children are working at machines for 12 to 14 hours a day. Poor people crowd the towns and cities because there's nowhere else to go. So all of this progress is actually leading to everyone's misery. So those writers and intellectuals began to lose faith in the ability of human reason to solve every problem that they were facing. The efficiency in agriculture and industry had deep social consequences they didn't think about. Rich landowners pushed ahead with enclosure, what means they took over and fenced off common land that was formerly shared by peasant villagers. The farm output ended up rising, and profits rose because large fields were needed and fewer people were there to work them. Small farmers were forced off their land because they couldn't compete with the large landholders. The jobless and landless farm workers then started migrating to the cities, so the population is increasing. Now that we've just talked about the history of this time period, we're going to start talking about some of the authors that we're going to read and some of the literature during this time period. So the first one is going to be John Dunn. Okay, so Dunn is in you just finished something. And he pioneered metaphysical poetry. It was a new, witty, cerebral style that they called this metaphysical poetry. It was highly intellectual, and it deals with the philosophical and metaphysical issues. He uses extended metaphors, which are called conceits, to compare very dissimilar items. And then he also uses paradoxes, which we talked about before, as contradictory statements or a sentence that contradicts itself. He drew from many fields of study for his poetry, such as like a drawing compass. So you've seen those like in math or maps and stuff like that. And he has an unusual degree of intellectualism, subtle arguments that raid the worlds of science, law, and philosophy, and has surprising but strangely accurate comparisons that he makes throughout some of his works. Another person we're going to kind of skip over is Ben Jonson, and he is a Puritan writer, but we don't really talk about him too much, and we're not going to read his works. But like Johnson, John Milton, our next guy, is really schooled in the classics of Greek and Latin literature, and believed in the Calvinist deep devotion to God, so a lot of his works are going to be religious. He was born to a prosperous middle-class family and studied at Cambridge. He wrote political pamphlets for the Puritan cause when the battle between Charles I and Parliament was in its midst. One of his pamphlets was a ringing call for freedom of the press. He supported the Commonwealth and the Protectorate, so Cromwell, and he defended the execution of Charles I, but he lost hope of forming a just society on earth when Cromwell's rule turned to dictatorship, because he became disillusioned when those promises that were made remained unfulfilled. The bigger chunk of text we're going to read for Milton is the book Paradise Lost. We're only going to read a little excerpt of it, a section of it. But it's Milton's grand epic poem, and it explains why God allows suffering in the world. It reflects Milton's humanistic love of poetry and his Puritan devotion to God. Again, this is the neoclassical time period, so it is the age of reason. We have a shift. So writers of the Enlightenment rediscover and admire qualities of classics, so those Greek and Latin texts, and they believe in harmony, restraint, and clarity. They're going to imitate the styles of classic writers from Greece and Rome, so those myths like we talked about before, and they were going to refer to those myths, gods, and heroes in those classics. They also favor general wholes rather than individual viewpoints, so talking about a big idea rather than narrowing down on one little itty-bitty viewpoint. And they're very fond of satire and aphorisms. Now, an aphorism is something that Ben Franklin kind of also coined a lot. We know more of his than anyone else's. So it's kind of like a penny saved is a penny earned, or three may keep a secret if two of them are dead. So that's kind of what aphorism is, like little sayings. But satire, we're going to talk about a little bit more, but it's a literary technique that mixes criticism with humor. Literature of the period was also influenced by the Restoration. You had the Restoration Theater where Charles II reopened the theaters, and those end up thriving, so we have some plays. You have John Dryden, who's a poet laureate, and he wrote the first prose and was a neoclassicist, so that means that his poetry reads kind of like a story and that there is not a lot of rhyme, and the lines aren't necessarily as cut. You have Alexander Pope, who had a lot of wit and elegance of the neoclassical style. And then we're going to read a lot of Jonathan Swift. He's a biting satirist who pointed out the flaws of human nature. Other people include Daniel Defoe, who wrote the first English novel called Robinson Crusoe. And then he also appealed to the growing middle class, so that's kind of what that story is about. Then you have the two guys, Addison and Steele, who published the first English periodicals. The Tatler and the Spectator were aimed at the growing middle class as well. So that's kind of where all this is going, is that working middle class. And a periodical is something that's released over time, so it doesn't all come out at once. Samuel Johnson was another influential writer during this time period, and it dominated the age. He actually befriended and nurtured writers, actors, and painters of this time and kind of helped them along. And he was known most for publishing the Dictionary of the English Language, the first authoritative dictionary in English. So even though we did have this age of the Enlightenment, progress did come with a cost of suffering. Writers and artists turned away from their faith and the power of reason, and they kind of rejected that neoclassicism is at the end of this. Writers shifted instead to expressing themselves in the language of the day and charged their work with more emotion. So we'll be able to understand these a little bit more. As we go through this unit, we are going to see some satire throughout a lot of the writing. Again, satire is a literary technique that mixes criticism with humor. So they're going to use laughter as a weapon to encourage some kind of change or bring about some kind of change, which is like a social reform of the time. There are two really big styles of satire. There's Horatian satire, which is playfully amusing. It seeks to correct some kind of vice or foolishness with gentle laughter. So it's not really harsh. Whereas Juvenalian satire is really dark. It's a dark kind of laughter. It's bitter, and it criticizes corruption or incompetence with scorn and outrage. A lot of the satire we're going to read are going to comment on and criticize society. It's going to make fun of a topic by making it seem overly ridiculous. News commentators, political cartoonists, comedians, and screenwriters and songwriters do this all of the time. Some examples are like The Simpsons. They make fun of like the education system, sibling rivalry, and violence on TV and sports. And then you have shows like Saturday Night Live and Mad TV that have skits that make fun of real-life political events that are going on. There are several ways to recognize satire. Oftentimes, the author is going to clue the reader in. They're going to cite previous satires that they may have written before or ones that people are publicly known with. And then the subject matter and its treatment, they're going to conceal and give concrete, topical, and personal subjects. They're often going to allude to gossip of the moment. So it's really important that we have all this background information so we know what's going on and why they're making fun of what they're making fun of, so we can pick up on those things. It's important that it's fresh. No one cares 50 to 100 years later what's going on unless we know the history. So they want to make sure that it ties in greatly to what's going on during that time period. We wouldn't write a satire today, though, about things going on back then because it wouldn't be relevant. So back then, they're writing of things that are actually happening right then and there. So a great way to know what's going on in history is to read satire of that time period. And that's what we're going to do. Some other key ways to show that things are satire is it's going to contain some like dirty words that it might make you giggle. It's going to have comic words and terms. It's going to use conversational and non-literary language, so it'll be easier for you guys to understand while still being very in-depth about what's going on. And they're going to produce the unexpected. They're going to try and like have a shock value to it. Here are presented for you guys different weapons of satire, tools that they use. So sometimes they use paradox, sometimes antithesis, which is a contrast of two things. Sometimes they give you a parody or an imitation or exaggeration. That way it gives some kind of effect. You see this a lot in political cartoons. Sometimes you have an anticlimax at the end, so it's very disappointing. It doesn't end the way you wanted it to. Obscenity, extremely offensive things, We're definitely going to read one that covers that. Violence, vividness, exaggeration, and irony are all other weapons that we can use to distinguish whether or not a text is truly satirical. The final test for satire is that the reader is going to feel a mixture of amusement or contempt. So you're going to like be happy and lighthearted and laugh about it, but still be upset because some people just don't like change. So if you're kind of unsure of like, I'm not really sure if I should laugh at this or not, it's kind of like dead baby jokes, right? You feel bad for laughing, but some of them are so kind of funny. And that's what ends up happening here. It's just a darker humor.